Today we're going to be speaking about Jerusalem, especially in the context of Jom Jeroesjalajiem, Jerusalem Day. Now, Jerusalem is a city that evokes so many emotions for so many different people. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jeroesjalajiem, Shalayim, Shalom, a city of peace. Shalem, meaning whole or complete. A city that gives so many people a real sense of wholeness and spirituality. At the same time, Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel. But contradictory, it's also statistically the poorest city in Israel. Jerusalem is, in Israeli political parlance, the eternal, undivided capital of the state of Israel. Jerusalem Day represents the conquest of the eastern side of Jerusalem and the Old City from the Jordanians in 1967 and the unification of the city. At the same time, for many, that's considered to be seizing territory. So the way that we see Jerusalem and the words that we use, the nuance, the narratives, are very different for very different people. What we're going to try and do today is go and explore different theologies, narratives, histories, and pasts, and see how they connect in with the way that the city that you see behind you looks today. So we're going to begin talking very, very briefly about this gentleman over here. The gentleman that you see behind you is King David. 3,000 years ago, King David arrived to Jerusalem. At that time, it was a small fortress city called Yevus, a Jebusite city called Yevus. When he arrived because he was looking for somewhere to make a capital, to unite the different Jewish tribes, each of them located in a different area. He chose what became Jerusalem. He chose Jerusalem because it had a water supply. It was in the mountains. It was easily defensible. It was also on a major trade route. But perhaps, if I share a screen with you, the most important reason that he chose Jerusalem was because, and here we see in front of us the small Jebusite city, or the area that was the small Jebusite city, and above it, if I annotate, we can see here a mountain. This mountain that we see here is Mount Moriah. According to Jewish tradition, this is where the Even Ashtiyah, the foundation stone, the world was created from, is located. According to tradition, I pick up my Bible, and it came to pass after these things, Genesis 22, that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. Take thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. So in front of us, we see at the top of David's city, and over here, you can see the origins of David's city was Mount Moriah. Now, as time went by, David passed away. And we'll clear the drawings. David passed away. The city continued to grow. And ultimately, up on top of Mount Moriah, Solomon, his son, builds the first temple, which is up over in this direction. But what I want to do with you now, I'm going to clear this, or we'll stop sharing. What I'd like to do is to take you into the city of David. So here we are. We're now inside the city of David. And behind me, what you can see is the remains of what Elat Mazar, the chief archaeologist, believes was David's palace. David's palace built up towards the top of the city of David, today outside the walls of the old city, just below Mount Moriah, where ultimately his son Solomon will build the first temple. Now again, if I go to show you, So I go to show you that in this area around the palace of David were discovered a clay bullae. This is an imprint that was used to seal notes and scrolls that were sent. This particular bullae is incredibly important because it mentions Yehukal, son of Shlomeyahu, and Gedaliah, son of Pashur. There were two bullae found in close proximity one to another, mentioning these two characters. And these two characters were mentioned in the same verse of the book of Jeremiah from 2,600 years ago. I'll read for you Shephatiah son of Matan, Gedaliah son of Pashur, Yukal son of Shlemiah, and Pashur son of Malchiah heard what Jeremiah was saying to all the people. And the official said to the king, let that man be put to death. So we understand in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah was a prophet. Jeremiah was a prophet who was saying to King Zedekiah, you need to give up to the Babylonians or the city will be destroyed. These two gentlemen who I mentioned, whose seals were discovered, were attendants in the king's court. We find them in the same verse. We find their seals next to each other. This is incredibly important. Remember, archaeology is not just it's not so much an objective science. It's also got a great deal of subjectivity. Because archaeology, you look for what you want to find, and maybe you only go down as far as where you want to go. Ir David, the city of David, is not just about finding archaeological remains. It's also about showing, remember it's Jerusalem Day, that the Jewish state today is built upon the foundations of the Jewish state, with Jerusalem as its capital, 3,000 years ago. Now, if you look at the picture now directly in front of you, take a look at the drawing. What you can see here is the water source of David's Jerusalem. Now, after David came Solomon. After Solomon, the kingdom, united kingdom of David and Solomon split into two. We're now in Jerusalem, the capital of Judea. And in the year 722 BC, the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. All that remained was the kingdom of Judea. When in the year 701 BC, the Assyrians came down towards Judea with Jerusalem as its capital, King Hezekiah, the king at the time, realized that he needed to divert the water source into the city so that when the city would be besieged by the Assyrians, the water would still be inside the city. This pool that you see here is called the Shiloh pool, the pool of Siloam, as it's mentioned in the New Testament. The Siloam pool is mentioned in the time of Jesus, where Jesus heals a blind man by taking the muddy waters of the pool and wiping them on his face. I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to take you to see the tunnel which we just mentioned. Directly behind me, you together with me are now inside that tunnel. If you look very carefully, you can see the jagged markings on the walls where two teams of diggers were digging frantically, one towards the other, trying to complete the tunnel to bring the water into the city before the Assyrians attacked. Ultimately, the Assyrians were kept at bay, and until today, we can walk inside this tunnel. The tunnel ultimately exits at the Shiloh pool, the pool of Siloam. Now, if you look behind me, you can see the steps of the pool. This is what remains of the pool. But also, look very carefully up to the top. You can see the old city of Jerusalem. This pool was the entry point into the city. No wonder Jesus and others were meeting here around this pool after a long journey to finally arrive to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage. From here, they would rest and relax before going up to the top of the city, to the temple on the peak of Mount Moriah. Now, I want to show you, go again. We go again here. What are we looking at right now? So we started our journey up from the pool of Siloam, the pool of Shiloh, and it looks like we're in an underground tunnel, like an underground train tunnel. But if you look very carefully, you can see that the stones on the floor are from 2,000 years ago. There's a debate whether this road was paved by Herod, repaving the Pilgrim Road, or even perhaps if it was repaved at the time of Pontius Pilate, who, of course, the archaeologists, not necessarily huge fans of Pontius Pilate, who is a difficult figure in both Jewish and in Christian history as well. But why today is it underground? Because the houses of the city of David are above, or more specifically, I'm calling this place the city of David. But the people that live above, if we change the share, the people that live above, remember this road that you're seeing goes from the pool here up to the city, up to the temple rather, over here. But if we move forward in time, this wall that you see down at the bottom over here, this wall that you see here no longer exists. What do we see? Let's clear everything. we see neighborhoods. This neighborhood over here and on into here is called the Silwan. It actually takes its name from Siloam or Shiloh, so the original Hebrew name. But this is a neighborhood of around 25,000 people. There are also around 600 Jews living in this area. Now, these 25,000 people living in this area will not necessarily identify with the archaeological project that's taking place over here. It's taking place under their homes. Now, the project is seeking to understand the Jewish links and connections to this place. But ultimately, the people that are living here are living on the eastern side of Jerusalem, an area that was Jordanian between 48 and 67, when the Jordanians occupied and annexed the area. And their national narrative is diametrically opposed to celebrating Jerusalem Day. So we start to understand that archaeology is much more than dry science. It's also about narratives as well. Now I'm going to move forward. I'm going to move forward from here. I'm going to take you up into the city. So here we are right now. Here we are right now, up next to the area where the temple stood. Some of you may recognize this area. This area is actually the Western Wall. Now, if I share a screen with you, I'd like to show you a picture. Here we are back on the road. The area where I'm now standing, this is a recreation. And what do we see? We can see that this is the meeting point between the Western Wall and the Southern Wall. The Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall of the Kotel, the central focal prayer point of the Jews today. What you can see here is an arch called the Robinson Arch. Now look here at the bottom of the top of the arch. The arch comes over. These were shops down below. The Western Wall was actually a shopping street, believe it or not. And the reason I want to focus where I'm drawing right now is because if I clear the pictures, if I clear the drawing and move you forward, you can see that at the end of the 19th century, where I was drawing before was actually the ground level. And the reason I mention that and why it's so interesting and important for us now is because if we move forward to the Western Wall, this is the ground level. For those of you that have visited the Western Wall prayer area, this is where you saw the bottom of the arch. So the ground level is actually down here. You can also see that where the men's section and the women's section of the Western Wall is only a fraction of the Western Wall. It goes significantly to the south, and it also continues on to the north as well. In fact, the Western Wall was the longest of 4 walls surrounding the Second Temple complex. It was 488 meters long. So we're looking at just 60 meters out of 488 in this area. Now, moving us back, remember here we saw the top of the arch down to where the shops. In the year 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple. Herod, who rebuilt the Second Temple, didn't use any cement, just gravity, stone on stone. The arch had a keystone, which if it was knocked out, would fall and smash on the ground and the whole arch came down. And if I take you back to the road, we're now underneath the picture we just saw. The arch was above us. When the keystone fell down, look right here where my finger is, and you can see the indentation in the ground where the arch comes crashing down. All of this, all the way up to here, is completely under the ground on the other side where the Western Wall is. But I want you, for just for a moment, you've made your way up the stepped road. You're now a Jewish pilgrim, and you've made your way to the temple. You're now standing here. You've made the pilgrimage. By the way, in Hebrew, we have 3 festivals when traditionally the Jews would make a pilgrimage to the temple. They're called the 3-foot festivals. In Hebrew, the Chagim. Chag is a festival when you would go on foot. It sounds like Hajj, the idea of making a pilgrimage to Mecca. So the Hajj actually comes from the Hebrew Chag. The 3-foot festivals were Passover, which we just had, Shavuot, the harvest festival, and the festival of tabernacles, Sukkot. So the Jews would come in their hundreds of thousands here, making pilgrimage to the temple. When you arrive at the temple, before you can go up, what do you need to do? Now look over here, you can see some of the shops. Imagine you've now arrived to visit the temple, and you're hot, and you're sweating, and you're not quite ready to go. What do you need to do? First of all, today Jews use prayer in order to gain connection, closer connection with God. But back at the time of the temple, it was sacrifice, not human sacrifice, don't worry, but use of different animals for different needs, different prayers, if you will, or different sins that have been committed, or plants. So the first thing you need to do is buy the right sacrifice. There's an argument whether you would purchase an animal here, or whether you would buy a token or receive a token and exchange it for the animal up on top where the temple stood. So you arrange your sacrifice. Very importantly, once you've arranged your sacrifice, you needed to get some of these. These were half shekels, machatzita shekel. The money that you've got, I'm not too au fait with Dutch money, but most money has pictures of people. And you're not allowed to bring graven images into a Jewish holy place. So you would take the money that you have and you would change it for a machatzita shekel, the half shekel. This was a tax in order to enter up onto the temple. You would pay it at the entrance, and it was your part in the upkeep of the temple over the course of the year. So you have your sacrifice and your machatzita shekel, but there's one very important thing that you still need to do. And what we have right here, if you look behind me, is that right now I'm inside what's called a mikvah. If you look very closely behind this gentleman with a purple shirt, you can see the arch coming down. This is one of dozens of mikvaot. It's a Jewish ritual baths that are in and around this area. Why? Because the last thing you need to do before heading up onto the temple is to ritually purify yourself. These baths were filled with undrawn water. You can't take buckets and fill them up. The water needs to come either from the rain or naturally flow down. In this case, there were aqueducts that filled up the mikvahs. And if you look here very closely, you can see a line down the middle. You might be asking yourself, what is this line? Maybe it's men on one side, women on the other. But actually, it's a lot more simple than that. Right now, I'm coming down on the impure side. I'm not going to do it for you, but here's where I would take off my clothes, going completely and utterly naked. This is a practice, by the way, for ritual purification in Judaism that we have until today. And from this is extrapolated baptism. This is essentially exactly what Jesus went through at the hands of John the Baptist 2,000 years ago. So I completely submerge myself under the water. And then, when I come back out, I'm now on the other side, and I now leave purified. So one way in for the pure, and one for the impure, and one way out for the pure. I now wrap myself in my garment, and it's now possible to go up and visit the temple. So where do we go? Where is the entrance to the temple? So the entrance to the temple, here we go. Again, here we can see the western wall, and right here we have the southern wall. And I'm just going to annotate for a moment. So the western wall is here. That's where your feet are when you're praying at the western wall, when you're visiting the western wall. And here we have the southern wall. Now this is not the end of the southern wall. This actually is an Umayyad palace, a Muslim palace from the 8th century AD, which was built into the southern wall. The southern wall continues on the other side. You can see here, and we'll speak about it later, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is built into the southern wall of Jerusalem, the southern wall of the Temple Mount complex. What are we looking at here? We're now looking at how the southern wall actually looked like. It's a model from the Israel Museum. So here's Robinson's Arch. We've come round the corner to the southern wall. The Umayyad Palace is over here, if you will, over here. On this particular gate, there are actually three. When you would enter up to the temple, you would go in this door, in the triple door. And when you leave, you would go out the double door. The only people that would go the wrong way were those that were in mourning. Why would you go the wrong way? Well, because when someone's going the wrong way, you look at them funny. And maybe you ask, why are you going the wrong way? And that's an opportunity to tell someone that you're in mourning and get comforted. Most people would go in through the triple door. These doors were known as the Hulda gates. Hulda is a rat in Hebrew. And it's possible that's because you would actually enter from underground, rising up towards the temple. We'll talk more about that later. But it's also likely that it's due to the burial place of the Jewish prophetess Hulda, which is right over here. So I want to move us forward and see that was the model and see what it actually looks like today. So right now, you can see behind me the triple gates. But you can also see that they're blocked. They've been blocked for around 900 years. You can see the steps behind me that the pilgrims would make their way up. This was the way into the temple. Now, they're blocked. We're not able to make our way up right now. But what I'd like to do now is talk about someone, perhaps one of the most famous Jews in history, that 2,000 years ago when he visited the temple, would have been able to make his way through those gates and up towards the temple. The person that I'm talking about, this very famous Jew, was born in Bethlehem, conceived in Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, spent a little bit of time in Jerusalem in his early life. We only really start to hear about him in great detail after his baptism in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. He then makes his way up to the Galilee, where he spends around 3 years. Of course, we're talking about Jesus, with his missionary activity, bringing his incredible morals and values and ideas to the world. And finally, he makes his way back down to Jerusalem for the final week of his life. For the next section of our tour, we're going to be exploring some different Christian holy sites and getting an insight into the Jewish world as well that Jesus was born into 2,000 years ago. And move us forward. What we're going to be doing now is actually flying across to the other side of the city, and here we are right now, actually on Mount Zion. The church that you see here, the Hagia Zion, or the Dormition Church. One idea, it's a Catholic church built by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was actually Lutheran, but he built it for his Catholic pilgrims to the Holy Land. And there's one idea that Mary, Jesus' mother, like her son, was without sin, and rather than dying, she fell asleep and rose to heaven from here. There are also links to Ephesus in Turkey, many different ideas. The Greek Orthodox believe she died a natural death and was buried on the other side of the city, actually next to the Garden of Gethsemane. But right now, I didn't bring you here to talk about the Dormition Church. We're standing on the roof of the room of the Last Supper. The Last Supper is said to have taken place here on Mount Zion. And I'd like to read just a moment. Let's flip through. And to click to the book of Mark. Jesus' disciples asked Jesus, they say it's a festival time. We should get together, we should have a meal. So Jesus sent 2 of his disciples and tells them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, say to the owner of the house he enters. The teacher asked, where is my guest room? Where may I eat the Passover with my disciples? So what's going on here? Jesus tells his disciples, go into the city of Jerusalem, find a man carrying water, and he will show you where we will hold our meal, what we know as the Last Supper. Now, why does Jesus say find a man carrying water? I always found this very confusing. Let's say 200 years ago, who would carry water? Well, certainly 2,000 years ago. The expectation would be, and thankfully things have changed, the expectation would be that it would be a woman. That the women would do the washing and the cooking and the cleaning and the bathing of the children, the washing of the sheets and the washing up. Why would a man carry water? It's very important. 2,000 years ago, the Jewish world was in crisis. The temple is still standing at the time of Jesus, not for much longer. But the priests in the temple are a small sect who are seen as elite, corrupt, and distorting the true path of Judaism. Most of the Jews hated the priests in the temple, and those were the priests. For example, the high priest that was entering the Holy of Holies and asking for forgiveness on behalf of all the Jewish people on Yom Kippur. And most of the Jews hate the priests. Who's really in control, though, in the land? It's the Romans. So the Jews are being ruled over by their own priests, who they despise and see as heretic, and by a foreign occupier. And what's even worse is that the priests are seen as in league with the Romans. So the Jews are crying out for a leader, both a national leader to cast off the yoke of Roman oppression, to get rid of the Romans, but also a religious leader, maybe to found a new direction or a new faith, if we're speaking of Christianity. But maybe also not necessarily looking for a new faith, but someone who could restore Judaism to its correct ethical and moral path. This is the world that Jesus was born into 2,000 years ago. Now I want to move forward just a moment. We're now going to make our way beneath our feet and into the room of the Last Supper. Now, when I said to you room of the Last Supper, for those that haven't visited, I imagine it may have conjured up images for you of Leonardo da Vinci, the big room with the Last Supper. And just look behind me for a moment. Maybe it doesn't look exactly like that. I also will tell you that whilst since the first century this has been identified as the location of the Last Supper, the room itself that you see is mainly Crusader era and later. But nonetheless, look behind me for a moment and think to yourself, what do you see that connects you to the Last Supper? Maybe these columns or the arch vaults. Maybe it's what you see over here. It looks like the apse, maybe of a church. But the reality is that the architecture that you see here is Ottoman, and the apse that you see here is actually a mihrab, which denotes the Qibla, or direction of prayer, south towards Mecca. So if we were speaking about different political narratives in the city of David, here we are in the room of the Last Supper, which we'll speak more about theology in a few moments. Such an important place for Christianity, and yet we see that until 1948 it was a mosque. Now, is that because Jesus, or as he's known in Arabic, Isa, is a great prophet also for Muslims? Muslims believe that Jesus was not son of God, but a prophet, Isa, a great prophet. Maybe, but actually in this case, it's because the room of the Last Supper is adjacent to a compound known as the tomb of David. And there are some who believe that King David is buried also here on Mount Zion, and it was Dawoodian, whirling dervish, mystical Muslims who used this place as a mosque through till 1948. But I want to take you back 2,000 years. However you imagine this room would look, we're now in the room of the Last Supper. Now it's here in this place that Jesus essentially reveals what's going to happen. He reveals that he's going to die. He says, this wine is my blood. This bread is my body. He reveals that he's going to die on behalf of all of his disciples, in fact, on behalf of all of us. But remember, this was a festive meal. If you didn't already understand earlier, what festival was this? This was the Passover festival. Now, Passover, which we've had recently, is a festival when the Jews remember how they escaped from slavery in Egypt. The wine that Jesus was drinking are the 4 cups of wine that Jews drink on the Passover Seder. The bread would likely have been very flat. It's the matzah, the unleavened bread. The Jews escaping from Pharaoh in Egypt without having time to let the bread rise. But what's also fascinating, remember the Bible, the Christian Bible that I have here is the New Testament. The New Testament, following the Old Testament, the continuation of the same journey. If Passover, this moment in Jewish history, commemorated the physical redemption of the Jewish people from Egypt, what took place in this room is perhaps takes on a whole new level. Because here the sacrifice is not the ram's blood on the door so that the angel of death would pass over the Jewish children, the Jewish households, and take the firstborn only of the Egyptians. Here, the blood is the blood of Jesus. And whilst the story of Passover is the story of the physical exodus or redemption of the Jews from Egypt, what happens here is that Jesus reveals not just the physical redemption, but the spiritual redemption, that his sacrifice will enable all of us to gain a place in the kingdom of heaven. Now I want to fly over to the other side of the city. But just before that, I'd like to share, going over to the picture. What you're looking at here is the church in the Garden of Gethsemane. And if I stop sharing for a moment, I want to take us actually, and we'll start in the garden itself. So following Jesus' Last Supper, he also reveals to his disciples here at the Last Supper that one of them will betray him. Jesus heads over to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, behind me, you can see the Church of All Nations. We just saw the entrance. But I want you to imagine that this church was not here. This church was built in the Byzantine period, only in the 4th century. You can see a nicely curated olive garden. But at that time, this was a wild, unkempt area of olive trees. In fact, Gethsemane comes from the Hebrew and Aramaic word gat shmanim, which means an oil press. And here were the olive trees. Behind the church is actually an ancient olive press. And it was here that the olive oil that was in ritual use in the temple would come from the olive trees here at the Garden of Gethsemane. Now here at Gethsemane, Jesus leaves his disciples and he goes to pray. He goes to pray and he goes to contemplate. Now, some of you may wonder, as he's praying, he's in pain, he's asking for the suffering to be taken away from him. And some of you may be wondering, well, Jesus, how can he be in pain? He knows he will die, but he also knows he will rise. So what's the big deal? But of course, whilst Jesus knows what will happen, and Jesus is God, Jesus is also man. And Jesus understands the pain of what will happen, the pain that he is feeling, the abandonment by God in some ways. And it's very important to understand the pain that Jesus is going through, because if there is no pain and there is no suffering, there is no sacrifice. And if there is no sacrifice, there is no alleviation of the original sin, and theologically, the ability for us to gain a place in the kingdom of heaven. By the way, the olive is incredibly symbolic, because the best olive oil that was given as a tithe to the temple was almost not pressed, the oil oozing out of the olive. A small cold press, that's the extra virgin olive oil, that was used for perfumes. As you push harder on the olive, it will be used for, and maybe for cooking as well. As you push harder on the olive, the quality of the oil gets less and less and less. In fact, it also gets dirty because of the pith and the bitterness that goes out into the olive oil. And so when you push and you put stress on an olive, it almost looks like it's sweating blood. So it's a beautiful parallel to the pain that Jesus is going through here. Now I want to take you back across to the picture of the church. We've come through the olive garden of Gethsemane, and we're now going to make our way up and into the church. And now we're inside, and right at the front, a few things to look out for. The church was built by Antonio Barlucci, a Franciscan Catholic architect, very talented at creating churches that really evoke the spirit of the moment. This is the original Byzantine church back from the 4th century. All the Byzantine churches in Jerusalem were destroyed in the year 614 by the Persians. You can see that the modern church, built at the beginning of the 20th century, incorporates the ancient Byzantine church. But very interestingly for us is this stone here. You can see the mass ceremony taking place. This stone is considered to be part of the bedrock upon which Jesus prays, weeps, and asks for the cup of suffering to be taken away from him. Now, Jesus warns his disciples to watch guard, because someone is going to be coming. But each time he goes back, he finds that they've fallen asleep. As he arrives back for the 3rd time, people have come to arrest him. Now, who's come to arrest him? Who's in control here in the land? It's the Romans, right? So it's the Romans that come to arrest Jesus. No. The Romans are not those that come to arrest Jesus. Who come to arrest Jesus? It's the Jewish temple priestly guards. And remember we were speaking before, that the priests were hated by most of the Jews. They were seen as corrupt. They were seen as heretics to the true path of God, in league with the Roman occupier. most of the Jews absolutely detested and hated the priests. So we start to understand why it could have been that the priests would come to arrest Jesus. Because the messages that Jesus was teaching were not only against them, but they were also messages that most of the Jewish people would have identified with 2,000 years ago. I'm going to clear the drawings. I'm going to move us forward. And I now want to do a little bit of work on the map. So we'll take out our pen. Right now, we are in Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Church of all nations. When the Jewish priestly guards arrived, just also to give you some context, here is the city of David, the Kidron Valley, the southern wall. This is where the Umayyad palace is, and this, of course, was the entrance into the temple, which at the time of Jesus stood over here. This is the western wall over here. Once Jesus is arrested by the Jewish priestly guards, he would have been marched from here through the Kidron Valley and actually back up to Mount Zion. Remember this area, we're on the slopes of Mount Zion. Over here on Mount Zion is the room of the Last Supper. And when he's marched up here, he's marched to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. Now in Jewish tradition, trials would have taken place at the temple. The New Testament emphasizes that Jesus' trial, perhaps because it would have been hidden because of the support that he would have had, took place at the private home of Caiaphas, the high priest, up here on Mount Moriah, up here on Mount Zion. If I move forward, this is the modern church of St. Petrus in Gallicantu, which sits upon the archaeological remains of what is believed to be the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, I'm going to take us back. Remember, we're leaving the Garden of Gethsemane, and as we're making our way, so we're making our way towards the home of Caiaphas. What you see here behind me are 2,000-year-old steps. These steps lead up to the church of St. Petrus in Gallicantu. The church name, by the way, evokes how Peter, trying to see what was going on with Jesus, arrives to the home of Caiaphas. He's seen outside and is asked, "Are you with him?" And Peter, of course, responds, "I don't know him," 3 times. And just as Jesus prophesied, he denies Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. The steps that we see behind us are likely the very steps that Jesus would have made his way up from the Kidron Valley, up towards Mount Zion, up towards the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. I want to go back to the share screen and back over here. I want to go back to the map again, because this is where the story gets interesting. Now, again, let's take out our pen. So we're now over here on Mount Zion at the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, the traditional narrative, remember here is Gethsemane over here. The traditional narrative is that we understand that Jesus was convicted of heresy by the priests. So this is not altogether surprising. First of all, remember the priests hated the ideas that Jesus stood for, and most of the Jews hated the ideas of the priests. But also, very interesting, was that by the Second Temple period, there was a strong idea in the belief in the idea of a Messiah, that a Messiah will come and change the direction of the world. And also a very strong idea in the idea that there is life after death. Now, the priests didn't believe in the idea of Messiah or the idea of life after death. So convicting Jesus of heresy because of those beliefs, they could have convicted most of the Jewish people of heresy back 2,000 years ago. Nonetheless, Jesus is convicted of being a heretic, and it's now time to die. But there is a problem. Remember, the priest may have convicted Jesus and sentenced him to death, but can the priest carry out a sentence? No. Who's really in control? The Romans. And so the priests hand Jesus over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Now, the traditional narrative is that just over here is station number 1 of the Via Dolorosa. So the traditional day is likely that Jesus would have come over here. Station number 1 today is actually a Muslim boys' school called the Moriah School. But 2,000 years ago, it was the Antonia Fortress. And it's believed, the traditional understanding is that this is where Jesus was placed on trial and convicted of being a heretic, of calling himself king of the Jews, and sentenced to death. This is the Moriah school, the Muslim boys' school, is actually station number 1 of the Via Dolorosa. Now, if I clear it and move forward to the next map for a moment, let's zoom in. Let's annotate once more. So, right over here was the Antonia fortress. The traditional narrative is that it's here, station 1 and 2, where Jesus is convicted by Pontius Pilate. Station 2, right next door, where Jesus is given his crown of thorns, flagellated and beaten, and now starts his long, arduous walk through and across the city. He arrives here. Today, these stations, 1 to 14, the 14 stations of the cross, the Via Dolorosa, the way of the agony. This is a tradition that really is bedded in the Middle Ages, and the numbers of the stations connected to the Franciscans. Station 3 and 4, where Jesus falls for the first time and meets his mother as he walks on through. Station 5, where Jesus is struggling to carry the cross, and the Romans grab Simon of Cyrene and force him to help Jesus carry the cross. Station number 6, Veronica, who wipes Jesus' face with a cloth. Station number 7 and 8, where Jesus falls for the second time and passes the women who are weeping. He says to them, "Don't weep for me, weep for yourselves." Remember, Jesus has had a vision of the destruction of the temple that will take place in around 40 years, when the Romans will destroy not just the temple, but his temple, the temple of his people, in the year 70 AD, around 40 years or so after his death. He then continues on station 9, where he falls for the 3rd time, and the final stations are all here. This is considered to be the location of the Golgotha. Golgotha, like Golgolet in Hebrew, means skull. So the Golgotha is literally the skull hill. It's also known as the Calvary, Calvario. This is the skull hill, and it's believed that this is the location just outside the city walls where Jesus was crucified, within sight of everyone entering and exiting the city. But there is an alternative theory that is gaining traction. So this is the traditional pilgrim route. And if I clear away all of the pictures, I wanted to share with something that maybe is a little less known. I want to bring you back down, back to Jesus' trial. Let's annotate. Okay, Jesus' first trial at the hands of the priests, at the home of Caiaphas. Now, the traditional narrative, as I just told you, is over here to the Moriah boys' school, the Antonia fortress. But the Antonia fortress is where the Roman soldiers dwell. The Roman soldiers were here in this area because the powder keg, the place in the city that was most dangerous and inflammatory, was, of course, the Temple Mount. But the governors of the city did not live or did not rule from the Antonia fortress. They ruled from a palace over here. Today, this area here is the area of the Jaffa Gate and the Tower of David. But 2,000 years ago, there was a mighty palace that was built by King Herod. This area is called the Tower of David today because the Crusaders got everything wrong. I mean, useless at geography. It was nothing to do with David, who was 1,000 years earlier, and it was a palace of Herod. And so there is now increasingly strong belief that perhaps this is where Jesus' trial at the hands of Pontius Pilate took place. That it's here in this area where Ecce Homo, where Pilate reaches out to the assembled crowds and says, "Behold the man, is this the man that you want me to condemn?" And if that's the case, then could it be that the way of the agony was actually from here to here, where the Golgotha, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is today, and where the Golgotha was? Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should change the whole route, because sometimes faith is very, very important. And it's as important to retrace the steps that others have been following for 1,000 years as it is to know exactly where one place is located, where is another. Would you turn left or would you turn right? But it's interesting to understand that there are other theories. I'll also just mention that if we skip forward another picture, this is the city at the time of Jesus. This is the city of David. This is Mount Moriah, where Solomon builds the first temple. Herod 1,000 years later says, call that a temple? And he built these mighty walls to create a platform where he put a temple that was twice as high as the Dome of the Rock is today. The city itself, here you can see over here, this is the city as it stands today, over here, which is around over here. So within this purple area is the city today. So the city of David is outside the city, but it also means that the Golgotha is here. If the Golgotha is inside the city, could Jesus have been crucified here? How could Jesus have been crucified inside the city? How can that be? Surely he was crucified at a prominent entry-exit point so that everyone entering and exiting the city would see. This is what happens when you mess with the Romans. But if I clear a moment away, again, all the pictures, you can see that there are two outer walls to the city in this picture. This is the city wall at the time of Jesus. Smaller. Around 10 years after Jesus' death, the city walls were expanded to the north. At that point, the Golgotha was now inside the city. But at the time of Jesus, the Golgotha, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is today, deep inside the city, was indeed outside the city in the time of Jesus. I should mention, at the end of the 19th century, a British Army officer, Charles Gordon, arrived to Jerusalem, visited the Golgotha, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was so shocked by what he saw inside. It was so different to his Church of England version of Christianity. And he also saw that the church was inside the city and didn't understand how could Jesus have been crucified inside the city, that he went looking for another place where perhaps the Golgotha was. I just drawing a picture over a little blob over here, just north of the city, actually just over here, just north of the city is, I'll just remove all the annotation. Is a cliff face, a small cliff face. For those of you that have wandered around East Jerusalem, it's right next to the Arab bus station. And if you look very carefully in the cliff, I don't know if you can notice, just going to annotate again. Apologize for my artistic skills. If you look here, can you see a skull? Can you see the skull? Eyes? Nose? Until today, this place is called the Garden Tomb. Also, a Second Temple period tomb was also discovered here. And many people, particularly Protestant, prefer to visit the Garden Tomb. Not necessarily dogmatic that it was 100% took place here, but nonetheless, the Garden Tomb open to the sky, being able to see a tomb, really perhaps for many people evokes the spirit of what it was like in Jesus' time, more than the church that we're about to visit. So interesting to know that these different theories also exist. But we're now zooming into the city. Remember the Golgotha? We don't see the Golgotha today. It's no longer outside, or at least not from here. It's no longer outside the city walls. It's now deep inside in the center of the Christian quarter. And what we see here is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Church of the Holy Sepulchre was originally built after Emperor Constantine first permits Christianity after hundreds of years, 300 years of persecuting Christians. Christianity is allowed. Maybe that's, you could argue, because Constantine was a great believer. You could also argue that perhaps rather than fight against Christianity, by institutionalizing it, it could be utilized as a means of control. You can make your own decision about that. Nonetheless, after Constantine adopts Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Romans make way for the Byzantines, become the Byzantines. The church is built. Many credit Constantine's mother, who certainly was a true believer, the Empress Helena, for being intimately involved in the building of this church. This area over here, I'll just annotate again. Oh, it will work for me. There we go. This area over here, this dome, stands above what is believed to be Jesus' tomb. And just over here is directly above which is just this area over here, which is believed to be where the Golgotha was. And in a few moments, we're going to head inside. So here I am back on the steps. We've done a lot since you left me at the steps. So I'm now going to move forward. And we're now outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, the two entryways that you see directly behind me, where the church was destroyed in 614 by the Persians, partially rebuilt in the Byzantine period, most of what you see behind you is Crusader and later additions. You can see that one of the Crusader doors has been cancelled. So in just a few moments, we're going to be entering through this door over here. In the meantime, what I will point out is station number 10 at the top of the steps over here. Station number 10 is a closed station, where according to tradition, Jesus' clothes were removed from him before he was placed upon the cross. And something else to look out for. This church, again, the most important events of Christendom took place within its walls, and yet it looks a little bit haphazard, not necessarily looked after so well. One of the reasons for that is because it's been destroyed and rebuilt many times, but it's also because different groups of Christians were not necessarily able to get on with each other in order to look after the church. When the Crusaders arrived to Jerusalem in the year 1099, they set about rebuilding the church. But in 1187, Saladin, the head of the Ayyubid Muslims, banished the Crusaders from the city, and he gave the keys of the church to two Muslim families. Now, the Christians never regained control of Jerusalem, but they were allowed to make pilgrimage. But in order to go inside the church, they needed to pay tax. They needed to pay money to those two Muslim families that were opening and closing the church each day. Now, not all of them had money to be able to go in and out. The Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, came up with an idea. If you look here, can you see the ladder? Rather than go in and out of the church each day, which would cost a lot of money each time, the priest inside came down the ladder, let down a rope, and they were able to either bypass physically the tax by going through the doorway, or hoist supplies to their fellow priests that were inside the church. Now, today we don't need to pay money to go inside, and I want to take you inside. So follow me. We're now going to head inside the church. Our first destination inside the church is up on top of the Golgotha, the skull rock. If you look right here, you can see some of the original bedrock of the Golgotha. So we entered the church, we immediately went up some steps on the right, and here we are on what is believed to be the Golgotha. Now, the station that you see behind me, all the different stations and areas of the church belong to different groupings of the church. Syrian Orthodox, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Catholic. This particular one belongs to the Greek Orthodox, who are actually in control of around half of the church. And what do we see here? First of all, we can see Jesus on the cross. This is station number 12. Just over in this direction, station 11, where Jesus is nailed to the cross. Station 12, where Jesus is crucified on the bedrock. In fact, you can line up, and where my finger is right here, you can put your hand through and touch the bedrock, what is believed to be the Golgotha, the Calvary, the skull hill upon which Jesus was crucified. We know that it's Greek Orthodox because we can see the many different icons. Above us are also beautiful lighting sets. And if we're looking up, if you notice above the cross, can you see what is written? It's written I-N-R-I. Jesus Nazarenus Rex Theorim. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The idea being that this is the same mocking epithet that the Roman soldiers placed upon Jesus' cross, that he then carried across the city to the place where he would be crucified. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Now I want to take us down. Again, look behind. This is where we came in. We were outside. We then went up. Ooh, there we go. Up to the Golgotha. And now we've come down. Here we are standing by what the Orthodox believe called term Station 13. For the Catholic, Station 13 is up next to the crucifixion, where Jesus was taken down from the cross in the presence of his mother Mary. The stone that you see behind me is called the unction stone. According to tradition, this stone is the stone that Jesus' bare body was placed upon and prepared for burial. Visitors come here and take items of clothing, things that they brought. Maybe you have a sick relative and you want to imbue that person with the spirit. Jesus' bare flesh, it's believed, touched this stone. And this is the place where Jesus' bare body was prepared for burial. Notice the stone has made of this beautiful marble color, which is a little bit different to the rock of the Golgotha. And in a few moments, we'll say a few words about the rock itself and whether this really is the very rock upon which Jesus' dead body was placed. Nonetheless, this is believed to be the location where Jesus' body was prepared for burial. Right now, we're standing again at the unction stone, but directly behind me, we're going to head in that direction, and it takes us over to the rotunda. Remember that circular section all around the tomb of Jesus? So we're going to head over in that direction now. We're now inside the rotunda. The original Church of the Holy Sepulchre from 1,700 years ago, little remains. But the roots of this rotunda are the roots of the original church. The structure you see behind me is the Greek Orthodox edicule. This structure sits on top of what is believed to be the location of the tomb of Jesus. You can see people are lining up to go inside. The first room that they're going to go into, just behind these windows, is, according to tradition, when after Jesus' burial, a large stone was placed in front of his tomb. The priests urged the Romans to place a guard in front of the tomb. They said, Jesus' followers will take his body and claim that he has risen from the dead. But on Sunday morning, despite the guard, they were powerless to stop the divine taking place. The stone rolled away. Mary and Mary arrive and find that the stone has been rolled away and that Jesus has risen. They're then met by the angel who informs them that Jesus has risen. They then meet Jesus and head to the Galilee, where they see him again together with the disciples. The second room, which I'm about to show you now, just over here, is believed to be the location of the tomb itself. Let's go take a look. Share the screen. There we go. It's a very small room. You can see here a lady that is with us, deep, deep, deep in prayer. If you were looking, however, to see the tomb itself, you may be a little bit disappointed. It's believed that in the 11th century AD, the Muslim Caliph al-Hakim laid waste to much of the church and also hacked away and destroyed much of the tomb. Nonetheless, this is believed to be the location of where Jesus was laid to rest, and of course, then rose. Interesting, by the way, that this church that we're inside is known by the Catholics as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the grave, whereas for the Orthodox it's known as the Church of the Resurrection. We're talking about different narratives and how one event can be seen in different ways, death and resurrection. Nonetheless, right now we're inside with Jesus' tomb according to tradition, but I want to take you now to see something, one of my favorite places inside the church. We're going to step out, back out into the rotunda. And just before, here we go. Apologies. Before we do that, we'll just show you the difference. Okay, so we step back outside. Remember when we were standing by the edicule, there were some rooms behind. Now, remember I also mentioned before about the stone upon which Jesus' dead body was placed. Now that stone made of red marble looks a little different from the Golgotha. It's likely that actually it may not necessarily be the original stone. The story behind it is maybe even more interesting. After Jesus' death and resurrection, remember the city walls moved out. When the city walls moved out, stop sharing for a moment. When the city walls moved out, this area where we are right now, the Golgotha, was incorporated into the city. Now the area didn't remain barren and empty. The Romans built a temple here, a temple to the goddess Aphrodite, or Venus, if you will. And there was a mighty Roman temple here in this area. After the year 325 AD, Christianity is now the official religion of the Roman Empire. Helena, mother of Constantine, rides on her horse to the Holy Land, looking for where all the holy sites are. Where did the events of Jesus' life take place? She's pointed by locals in the direction of the temple, the Roman temple. She enters inside into this structure, which was a temple at the time, and she finds a high raised mound that she believes must be where the Golgotha was. The red stone that you saw was perhaps one of the paving stones, one of the stones of the flooring of that temple. Now, right here where the edicule is located, is just a stone's throw from where the Golgotha is. And this makes a lot of sense because, remember, Jesus had his Last Supper on Thursday night. He's crucified on a Friday. His trial by the Romans and his crucifixion on a Friday. He passes away at 12 o'clock midday. He's only taken down from the cross at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's a Friday. Shabbat's coming in soon. In Judaism, burial needs to take place very quickly at the best of times. But if Shabbat's about to come, you can't bury on Shabbat. Jesus will need to be buried after Shabbat. So his burial would have needed to have taken place very close by to where he was killed. Also, crucifixion was not a unique punishment for Jesus. It was a punishment for anyone that was seen as a threat, political threat to the Romans. And so it's likely there was a Jewish graveyard nearby. Now, when Helena arrives here, she thinks she's found the Golgotha. She thinks she's looking through the tomb where Jesus was buried. It must be close by. She starts to rip up the stones, and she finds maybe the most beautiful or ornate tomb. Remember, Jesus' tomb was actually the tomb of a wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea. She moves aside all of the other tombs that she finds and hones in and focuses on the one directly behind us, the tomb that she believes is the tomb of Jesus. But there was one tomb that was far enough away to escape the destruction of Helena. If I go back to sharing the screen again, if you look here, we're now inside a Syrian Orthodox chapel. Even when there are lines for hours and hours to go into the edicule, very few people know that if you come into the Syrian Orthodox chapel, if you do join me in Israel in the future, make sure you tell me to bring you here. You can see an opening here. If you head through this opening, I'm going to do it now. What do we find? We find a tomb from the Second Temple period. We can see these niches that the bodies were placed inside. So we now understand definitively that this was a tomb. We have what we believe is the Golgotha, and now we understand this truly was a cemetery. It also proves that this area was outside the city walls, because Jews never bury the dead inside a city, always outside the walls, which means that this area would have been outside the walls 2,000 years ago. Now, from here, we're heading back outside. You can see the edicule, back out to the edicule. Right above us is an opening to the sky. It's called an oculus. And it connects between the heavens and the earth. And keeping that in mind, the heavens and the earth, I want to take you to our very last spot inside the church, and that is this chapel right here. If you look behind me, you can see once again the bedrock of the Golgotha. The bedrock of the Golgotha, because the crucifixion is directly above us. This chapel is called the Chapel of Adam. It's said that when Jesus uttered his last breath, when he passes away at midday, when Jesus utters his last breath, it said that the earth shook. If you look carefully, you can see a crack here in the rock, perhaps even caused by the shaking of the earth. The earth shook, and a curtain in the temple ripped. The symbolism is very important. The curtain in the temple separated between the area of the high priest, the Holy of Holies, Kodesh HaKodeshim, that only once a year, the divine location of God's presence, that only on once a year, the high priest only would go inside the Holy of Holies. And that area was separated from humanity by a curtain. When Jesus utters his last breath, the ripping of the curtain symbolizes the removal of the barrier between man and God. Jesus' death, his sacrifice, enabled us to be able to connect directly with God and gain a place in the kingdom of heaven. It's also said that the earth shook, the curtain in the temple ripped, and the remains of holy people rose from the ground. If you're wondering why it's called the Skull Hill, perhaps it's because the remains of holy people, including perhaps Adam, this is called the Chapel of Adam, were located here figuratively with the removal of the original sin. Adam, the perpetrator of the original sin himself, rose up from the ground right here. So moving towards the end of our tour, I want to, from here, take us back towards the Temple Mount and give us the opportunity to head up on top. We can see right here the triple gates once more. But what I want to show you for just a moment is the double gates, which I didn't show you before. All that remains of the double gate, you can just here see part of it, and the second section course, hidden by the Umayyad palace that was built in the 8th century against the wall. This is also the back wall of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And again, you can see that like the triple gate, the gate is blocked. But the wonders of a virtual tour are that this time we're going to be able to go through the blocked gate. I'm going to clear the drawing. And what you're looking at here is actually what Robert Hamilton in 1927, a British explorer, after an earthquake that devastated Jerusalem, was given permission by the WAC, the Islamic authorities, to go and explore a little in and around the Temple Mount, if he would promise not to reveal what he found. What you're seeing here is us walking through, the double gate and making our way up from under the ground like a huda, like a rat, making our way up to the crescendo that will be the temple that we'll see ahead of us. The same thing exists also on the other side of the triple gate as well. And further to the east, there is an area called Solomon's Stables, which again, you can blame the Crusaders, they have nothing to do with Solomon. There are huge open areas from 2,000 years ago, which are still there, but we're not able to gain access to. But I'm now going to take you up on top. And we're going to finish our tour up here on top of, again, up till now I've been calling it the Temple Mount, but now we're going to understand that like everything, there are different narratives for everything. By the way, for those people that if there are people asking questions, I just wanted to say at the end of our tour, difficult with so many people, at the end of our tour, we'll be taking a look at all of the questions and I'll be happy to stay as long as it needs to explore with you and conversate with you and to answer different questions. So right here, you can see behind me the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the large mosque. In fact, it's the major mosque on top of what the Muslims call Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa complex. We'll talk more about the name in a moment. Or Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. This is the area that the Jews call the Temple Mount. Just behind the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, of course, the southern wall with the gates. So essentially, as pilgrims, we'll have walked up and underneath the area of this mosque. By the way, the architectural styling of much of what you can see is actually Crusader. That this area is not on the bedrock of Mount Moriah. It's on a suspended platform built by Herod. It's fallen and been rebuilt many times. It was originally built by Khalif al-Walid, the builder at the beginning of the 8th century. But what you see here is that a lot of it has been rebuilt by the Crusaders. When the Crusaders arrived to Jerusalem in 1099, they made this their ruling palace. Today, it's of course back in use as a mosque. Now, when Muslims visit the mosque, 5 times there are prayer each day. You're not permitted to pray each time in a mosque, but you can if you will. But you should pray together with the Ummah, or the nation, other Muslims, on a Friday for the major prayers. And before each prayer, you're commanded to wash the extremities of your body, so your hands, your feet, and to open your ears, your nose, and your mouth. And if you look here, you can see this beautiful fountain and chairs all around it. And this is a place for you to prepare yourself, to open up your senses and be alert and awake before you will pray to Allah. Now, Islam means submission, complete submission to God. And if Jerusalem became the capital city of the Jewish nation or Jewish state 3,000 years ago, if Jesus and the origins of Christianity are from 2,000 years ago, Islam actually brings us much more recent. Muhammad was born in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia today, the Arabian Peninsula, in the year 570 AD. You don't hear too much about him, although he's born into the ruling tribe of Mecca, until he's around 40 years of age. Mecca is a wealthy city, wealthy from trade and wealthy from tourism. What we know today as the Kaaba, the most important holy site in the world for Muslims, was also a place of religious veneration even before Islam. The time before Islam is known by Muslims as Jahiliyyah, or ignorance, and essentially that Islam removes us from the ignorance and brings us forward. The Kaaba, likely a meteor perhaps, it fell from the sky, was a place of religious pilgrimage for the Arab pagan tribes, but also for Jews and Christians that lived around the area as well. In the year 610, at the age of 40 years of age, Muhammad goes out into the desert to contemplate. Surah Al-Allah, Surah 96 of the Quran, you're commanded to read me as though I'm written in a drop of clotted blood. He receives a vision, essentially the first vision from Allah. He's very scared. because he's received the vision, 40 years of age. Nothing like this has ever happened. He returns to Mecca. He explains what's happened to his wife, Khadija, who's this very strong and incredible woman, and she supports him. And from here, Muhammad, rather than shying away, continues to receive more and more revelations. As he goes out into the streets, his revelations are about changing our ways. Don't rip off tourists coming to Mecca. Don't take advantage of people in trade. The rulers of Mecca at the time were very worried. If Muhammad's message catches, his Sahaba, his early followers, are getting bigger and bigger. If this message catches, Mecca is going to be in economic problems. Muhammad understands that if he doesn't leave soon, he may not be able to maintain himself and keep his life. When Khadija dies in 618, and also his influential uncle who's been protecting him, Abu Talib, Muhammad's days in Mecca are numbered. And in the year 622, Muhammad leaves Mecca and goes to Medina. This is the year 0, the beginning of the Islam. And here, Muhammad starts to bring more and more tribes, different peoples, different faiths, also pagans, to accept him as a prophet and to join Islam, meaning submission, full submission to God. Now, when he's there in Medina, he also reaches out to Jewish tribes living in the area. The Jews are reluctant to join him. He says, you pray towards Jerusalem. We'll pray towards Jerusalem. So the first direction of prayer in Islam is actually towards Jerusalem. But the Jews refuse to join him. The age of prophecy is over, as far as the Jews are concerned, and they do not join Muhammad. But Muhammad does garner more and more support. And by the year 630, he has created such a large nation, ummah, an army and nation, all protecting and fighting for each other, that he returns to Mecca and conquers the city unopposed. In the year 632, Muhammad takes the Kaaba, that stone in Mecca, and makes it the holy place, the holiest place in the world for Muslims. And in the same year, Muhammad dies. So Muhammad is a prophet, no son of God, but a prophet. So all of this I hope is interesting. I apologize for running a little bit over. But what I haven't explained right at the end of the Torah course is why is Jerusalem so important also for Muslims? We understand Jews, we understand Christians, but what about Muslims? The structure that you see behind me what you see behind me is the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock was built by Abd al-Malik in the year 691 AD. In 691 AD. It's not a mosque, it's a commemorative structure, and it sits right on top of where the Jewish temple stood. It sits right on top of the bedrock of Mount Moriah, the foundation stone where the world was created from according to Jewish belief. It also sits in the same place where the Holy of Holies, the divine presence of God. So it's the holiest place in the world for the Jews. And Muslims believe that at the end of the year 620, the beginning of 621, Muhammad from Mecca took a night flight. Surah 17, verse 1 of the Quran tells that Muhammad took a flight from the Holy Mosque, believed to be Mecca, to the furthest mosque, in Arabic, Al-Aqsa. So this whole area is known as Al-Aqsa, the furthest. Took a flight from the Holy Mosque to the furthest mosque, whose precincts we did bless. The oral traditions of Islam relate that Al-Aqsa, the furthest mosque, is here, right here. So the very spot that is the holiest in the world for the Jews is considered to be the very spot that Muhammad arrived to in order to then ascend up to heaven to receive more revelations from Allah. He flew across the sky from Mecca on a winged horse called Al-Burak, the lightning horse, descended down from his horse. And if we head inside, what we see here is actually a cave inside what the Jews call the foundation stone, and the stone that Muslims believe has the footprint that Muhammad ascended up to heaven from here. Well, right here in this location, in what's known as the Well of Souls, the Well of Souls by the Muslims, right here in this location is the third most holy site where Muhammad himself left his footprint, and for the Jews, it's considered to be the location of where the world was created from, and the Holy of Holies, God's divine presence until today. Right here in this place, we really perhaps understand the crux of the disagreement. Right now, we're standing in a 1400-year-old mosque, the third most holy site in Islam. From an Islamic perspective, how could this ever be given up on? From a Palestinian perspective, for example, predominantly Muslim, how could this not be part of a Palestinian state? But on the other hand, Jews around the world praying towards Jerusalem since the time immemorial. This is the holiest spot in the world for the Jewish people. How can it possibly not be part of the state of Israel? After 1967, this now is under Israeli sovereignty. But after 1967, the decision was taken so as to calm tensions that it would remain under Muslim day-to-day administration. So though we're right now in the holiest place in the world for the Jewish people, Jews are not able to come and enter this area or pray in this area. Until today, only Muslims. So we understand that there are two competing narratives. It's not a jigsaw puzzle where we can divide things easily between us. It's like an onion, layers one on top of the other. I'm going to finish the tour, for those that are still with us here, also on Facebook, at the Jaffa Gate, one of 7 working gates into the city. The reason I wanted to finish the tour here at the Jaffa Gate is because we call this the Jaffa Gate in English. In Hebrew also, Shal Yafo. Jaffa, it's on the beach. It's to the west. And so when we call it the Jaffa Gate, we're going out to the west. We're going forward. We're going to modernity. For Arabs, this is not called the Jaffa Gate. It's called the Bab al-Khalil. Al-Khalil is one of the names of the city of Hebron, to the south, a very conservative, religious city. So the same gate has different names and goes in different directions. This city of Jerusalem has different names. Al-Quds in Arabic, Jeroesjalajiem in Hebrew, and the narrative behind the city, who it belongs to, where the line should be, what should be its future. We all look at the same thing, but we look at it in different ways, through different prisms of different ideologies. But the last thing I wanted to say is maybe a glimmer of hope. Al-Khalil is not just Hebron. Khalil is also Abraham. Abraham is buried in Hebron. And Abraham is not only a great prophet for Jews, but also for Muslims, and also venerated by Christians as well. And if we're speaking politically about Israel, Palestine, Jewish, Muslim, then it's possible to focus on our differences. But it's also possible, even here with the name of the gate, to understand that maybe there are more things that connect us and bind us than there are things that separate us from each other. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone for joining me on the tour. I hope it was interesting, and you're welcome to be in touch with me if you have any questions about anything. These are my details. Thank you for bearing with me doing a virtual tour. Very, very different from being out in the field, dealing with the technology. But this is my information on Facebook, on Instagram, email. If you did enjoy the tour, it would be wonderful if you could leave a few words on TripAdvisor. Thank you so much, and I hope in this age of Corona that we'll all be able to see each other in person, hopefully here in Israel very, very soon. Thank you very much to all of you. Toda rabba, thank you, and shalom.